Thank you for joining us for the first RSL Literature Matters event of 2021. I'm Daljit Nagra, Chair of the Royal Society of Literature, and I'm so pleased to welcome so many of you. We're absolutely thrilled to be hosting this global conversation between two of the finest writers working today, Marlon James and Neil Gaiman. First of all, we must start with a huge thank you to Neil Gaiman, who, owing to daylight saving in the UK and New Zealand, is joining us at 6:30 AM. We hope you have a very strong cup of tea to hand, Neil. I believe you do as well. Literature Matters is the Royal Society of Literature's flagship event series, bringing together some of the biggest literary names to discuss why literature matters to them. Now, more than ever, we rely on literature to transport us to other worlds. So there couldn't be a better time to hear from two of the most revered fantasy writers of a generation. A couple of housekeeping notes before I hand over to the host for the evening, Matthew Sweet. Thank you to the British Library for co-hosting this evening. If you scroll down on the British Library player, you'll see the Q&A function. Please get sending in your questions and we'll ask as many as we can before Neil has to excuse himself for a very well-deserved nap. If you'd like to stay up to date with the RSL events, be sure to follow us on Twitter at RSL Literature or Instagram at Royal Society of Literature. So at RSL Literature at Twitter or at Royal Society of Literature on Instagram. This evening's conversation is chaired by film historian Matthew Sweet, who is writer and broadcaster and a presenter of BBC Radio 3's Free Thinking, which is, of course, one of my absolute favourite programmes on radio. So thank you, Matthew, for that. Matthew is the author of Inventing the Victorians, Shepperton Babylon, The West End Front and Operation Chaos. Though, of course, I'm sure we'll be on Operation Smooth tonight, if you can forgive that terrible joke. As well as presenting Free Thinking and Sound of Cinema on BBC Radio 3, he presents The Philosopher's Arms on BBC Radio 4. Matthew's documentaries include Memoirs of the Space Women, Stop Calling Me Dr. Sex, and Look What You've Done to Me. He was also series consultant on the Showtime drama Penny Dreadful, and brilliantly, Matthew played a moth for the planet Vortis in An Adventure in Space and Time on BBC Two. And as you can see, Matthew has unmothed himself to present himself as a veritable butterfly, who will now flap forth and speak for us. I hand over to you, Matthew Sweet.
Thank you, Daljit. I think that's the most comprehensive introduction that anybody has ever given me in my life. I'm very grateful for that. And welcome everybody to this event. We are going to attempt, two things simultaneously here. We're all having a night out with Neil and Marlon in conversation, but we are also collectively going to make an edition of BBC Radio 3's Arts and Ideas show, Free Thinking. So there'll come a point when I sort of stop and then start doing that, and we'll have to imagine that the green light is going on. And I think also that you get a bit more of this than is on the advertised programme, which is just down for an hour, I think. But actually, we're going to have the first hour will be a chat between Neil and Marlon and myself, and then we hand over to you for a bit longer, so we get some Q&A section, and I'll get those questions coming into me, and you get your chance to put your thoughts and questions and ideas to Neil and to Marlon. So I'm now going to kind of pause and gather my skirts for a moment, and from that point forward, we're all in effect on the radio together. We're going to invoke new worlds of gods and monsters on this edition of Free Thinking. Devils that rustle beneath the earth, strange vampire-toothed babies attended by fairy spirits, humiliated and forgotten deities now living on petty crime and the memory of how they were once venerated and adored. The programme is going to be busy with them. Thor, Nunyunini, the trolls of the blood swamp. They occupy two fictional spaces on two separate continents, mapped by two major writers in a pair of massive books. So what we're going to do now is construct a bridge between them, and those authors, Neil Gaiman and Marlon James, are going to meet on it. Marlon is the Booker Prize-winning author of A Brief History of Seven Killings, which has some of the same restless plenitude and strangeness as Black Leopard, Red Wolf, the first of his projected Dark Star trilogy, set in the 13 kingdoms of an epic, mythic African continent. Welcome, Marlon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Neil Gaiman has been a publishing phenomenon for 3 decades now. Comic books, novels, screenplays. He's just collected his short fiction as the Neil Gaiman Reader. But the book we're going to focus on tonight, I think, is American Gods, written 20 years ago, but now updated and expanded to be even bigger and longer and weirder. Hi, Neil.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to travel these continents together and also find some common ground in your reading and your writing lives. But maybe we can, as we start, choose a god or two to make sure that the Zoom stays stable and that everything is fascinating tonight. Who can we bring into the room, Marlon?
Oh God, you probably don't want my gods, because African gods tend to be tricksters. Yeah,
that might be helpful in this context.
It may be, but you know, it's you know, if I bring down a shoe, we might get hacked.
Neil.
I was thinking exactly the same thing. Is all of the gods that I'm ever interested in are at rock bottom, both tricksters and utterly unreliable, which may be why a time change means that we're talking at 6:30 in the morning my time, and that my Zoom link didn't work the first time I attempted it.
I'm quietly pleased in the way that
you're
so wary of this, Marlon.
I was saying that's what you get for writing about Loki.
Yes,
exactly. I think gods, all of the best gods they're unreliable. They're in it slightly for themselves. And it's always part of the fun of writing gods as a writer is you get to kind of channel that. You get to go, yes, this is, if I were a god, I'd probably be a very nice god, but the gods that I care about, the ones that I'm interested in, I would much rather see what Anansi's doing. I would much rather see what Loki is doing.
Well, I hope both of these are going to make their way into the conversation as we go on. It's the Royal Society of Literature who's got you together for us. I think there's a very strong logic to having you two together, because I think there's a bit of a Gaiman bromance going on, frankly. I think it began with you blurbing each other's books. And now, Marlon, you've written the intro to Neil's collected short fiction. This is quite an important literary relationship.
Well, for me, it began, reading his book. I swear to God, I did not do this for the show, but these two things are sitting on my desk. Even though I've bought Sandman like 15 times. So yeah, I think for me, the relationship, of course, started as a fan, as reading, Neil was one of the people who, when you read, you felt so grown up afterwards, because it was just so complicated and interlayered and multidimensional. And 17, 18, 19, and I'm thinking, damn, I'm smart. Because I'm reading these things, and also there's this thing that happens, I think, in literature. And I grew up very, very much in a Victorian tradition of literature, and that's the literature I grew up with. And there was always this idea that there's a certain kind of literature you're supposed to outgrow. That Wilkie Collins is, commercial, but George Eliot is art, or things like that. And it's always struck me as not just false, but a kind of an invented thing. And if that were the case, we would never have any mythology. And one of the things that I realized that and Margaret Atwood said this: if you want to know what human nature, check the myths. So for me, it was a validation for me that not letting go of make-believe was still a sign that I was grappling with very adult, very complicated, and deeply troubling stuff.
I'm really glad to hear you put that in the context of Wilkie Collins and George Eliot. Because I think in a way it was George Eliot who made one of the architects of that distinction.
Social realism, yeah.
Yeah. Neil, what about you? What about you from your end of this relationship? This fanboy.
I was a fanboy. I had read the point where I fell in love with Marlon's writing was being sent an advance copy of a Black Leopard, Red Wolf, and just falling into the prose, going, this is magic. This is something that I hadn't read before. It's as if you had not only a continent that was the cradle of civilization, but a continent with hundreds of thousands of years of its own mythology from every corner. And we, meaning the people who write fantasy, the people who use fantasy to try and unlock the world, had not really ever gone there to do that. And Marlon was doing that. And he was doing it with the kind of lucid and plangent prose that, reminded me of somebody like Angela Carter, where it utterly works as literature, and it works as high adventure, it works as mystery. You are presented with a handful of mysteries, and you come out at the end of the book feeling like any of the mysteries he has solved for you, he will probably unsolve for you, repuzzle for you, and make even more dangerous in future books.
Do you think there's any common ground between your work, Marlon?
Well,
we
absolutely.
both use the English language.
Any common preoccupations?
Yeah. Anansi has appeared in one way or form in both of our works. I think, common in the sense that a lot of Neil's work showed me ways in which to be in my own. And even before, I wrote, Black Leopard, in all the stories, the books I've written, reality is up for grabs. And I think that he's sort of one of his writing is one of the things that sort of, almost as a beacon to show the way you can write about these things and the way you can talk about things. It's the idea of death being a person. The idea that that horror, the thing people forget about things like fantasy and horror, but particularly with horror elements, is that horror is a seduction. I never grew up with literary snobbery, mostly because I couldn't afford it. It's the only category I needed for a book was that it was next. And so I grew up reading pretty much everything, and I never grew up ranking books. Gabriel Garcia Marquez is as important director to me as Chris Claremont. And I think it was also a reminder. I think sometimes we write literature as this sort of act of reduction. Here are the things I'm going to set aside. Here are the things I'm not going to bring to the room. Here are the aspects of my imagination that I'm going to put on damp. And to me, that's a terrible way to write a book. And it was a sort of a constant reminder that this is sort of wide world of literature that's open to you.
I suggested earlier on that we would be thinking about the different geographies and mythologies and theologies of the worlds that you've both created, that are constructed in your fiction. And I wonder whether I could get, as a sort of, in a way, this will demonstrate your knowledge and to each other, of each other, and allegiance to each other, to describe each other's worlds. Marlon, how would you describe the America that we encounter in American Gods?
It's weird. It's sort of a make-believe America, and it's a very true one. I think that America is a very new country, and I think that newness comes at the expense of forgetting the old, and it's forgetting the gods, but it's also forgetting the monsters. And I think every now and then America chafes at the idea of things it cannot explain. And the mythologies can definitely explain them. The gods can explain them. The order of the world that you don't really realize, can explain them. I've always felt that, not just in America, but in Jamaica, that if you really want to understand a place, you have to understand that there are 5 versions of the place running at the same time. And you don't even have to go to gods to find that. They're always these Americas. They're always these Jamaicas. They're always these Britons. It's one of the things that draws me to Victorian literature, because the world of George Eliot is Victorian, but the world of Jack the Ripper is Victorian too. So, and I think that's it. It reminds me of the many secret Americas in America, which I think even Americans have a problem grasping.
And Neil, can you take us through the Africa that we encounter in Black Leopard, Red Wolf? How would you characterize it?
Mythic and imaginary, in all of the best ways. It's an Africa that is transposed into myth time, and it takes all of the power of pulp fiction, the traditions of Conan the Barbarian, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, all of the sort of the glory of pulp literature. It invents an Africa which is a place of it is huge as Africa itself. You don't feel like you could sit there with a map and move through it in that sort of Lord of the Ringsy way, where you can actually flip back to the beginning of the book and see where on the journey to the East our heroes are right now, because it's more complex and more dangerous than that. It's brutal. But it's brutal in a way that feels human. And it's transformational. Everything is liminal. Everything is up for grabs. Identity is up for grabs. The space between people and animals and the distance between the two is utterly up for grabs.
And it draws on a heritage that is so deep and so rich. I'm very curious about the ways in which both of you have engaged with the mythologies that you draw in and reinvent in this work. Marlon, the sort of a lot of photographic evidence of you at work on this process. I was looking at some pictures you did for Vanity Fair, where we can have a sneaky look at what's behind you on your wall of Post-it notes, and it says things like, people turn out to be skeletons in disguise in many Yoruba folk tales. Another one that says, a cult that worships where lightning struck. Tell me a bit about how you were you kind of doing a job like the Golden Bough almost, drawing in so much material and processing it?
Yeah, there's a photo of me, I think it may have been on Facebook, and it was a photo of the day I got my first copy of Brief History of Seven Killings. So that would have been August 2014. And the book that it's standing on is a book on African ceremonies and folklore. So I started researching this novel before the last novel even came out. So that's a good 4 or 5 years. One, because I am a research geek. Two, despite being a writer, I love to not write. And there are a few things that take you away from writing more than research. So, but you know, I started researching not to write a book. I started researching because I realized I didn't grow up with my mythologies. I was talking about this. I gave the J.R.R. Tolkien lecture a few years ago. And one of the things I was talking about is, what does it mean when you can take your mythologies for granted? And I mentioned King Arthur, that the average British person probably doesn't think about King Arthur much. Why would they? But King Arthur is a fundamental mythology for Britain to hold on to the idea that they were always civilized. There was always chivalry, there's always courtly love, there was always this culture that was there, even though Arthur may be totally made up or an amalgam of a few warlords who were probably more backward than the Vikings. But that is a foundational myth. When I grew up in the diaspora, and ground zero for me is slavery, I know folklore, but what I didn't know was the mythologies, and also didn't know how much they would matter until I started doing the research. So I didn't start researching to write a book. I started researching because I want to know the gods and the monsters and the giants, and you know, mythology was history once, and it was religion before that. There is something that when you read Medea or the Metamorphoses, or you know, or Lord of the Rings, there is a certain kind of, you know, that mythology that was the sort of the thing that girds it. And I didn't have that. And when I found enough in searching for that, the book almost started to write itself, because I was just, you know, swamped with all these things. I mean, the Post-its covered the walls so much I forgot the color of the paint, because there was just so much. And of course, 9/10 of that won't make the book because it's just so much. But I very much wanted this sort of reservoir that I can sort of dive into.
But you needed to know personally what was in the water and discover that for yourself. I mean, how do you say, it sounds like you're doing this research and maybe kind of and finding the sources for maybe things that you might have heard the echoes of in the past. I mean, what did that do for you personally?
Well, one, it gives me a sense of belonging. It gives me a sense that I belong to more than an interrupted history. It's, you know, I didn't go, here's an example of something I wasn't expecting at all. Queerness, trans identities, queer identities, homosexuality, such and such. Given the bad reputation that sometimes we have with countries like Uganda, you think that's the last place you'd find any sort of queer validation, because we've all seen the news reports. And yet, there's so many ancient African societies that found ways to absorb all these identities, including queer identities. I didn't go looking for validation, but I found it. I said this to, I was at a reading in the Caribbean, mostly Black audience, and I said to them, you know, we were talking about trans and pronouns. I was like, have you ever noticed as a Black person, you never had a problem calling people them? You know, it's if you listen to rap videos or hear Black people talk in the South, it's and them, and I mean one person. So you ever notice that you have no problems with plural pronouns? So that's because it comes from a culture or cultures where that acceptance was there. It was shocking for me to realize that people who weren't even literate may have been more progressive than us.
So this was a bit of a journey of discovery then, and perhaps self-discovery. But Neil, you had already deployed some of the very figures who Marlon had been studying, haven't you, in your fiction? He's kind of skittered into the conversation already, but we should mention him properly. Anansi, there in the form of Mr. Nancy in your work, whose origins lie in West Africa. So how did he come into your life?
I think probably as a very small boy in my local public library, heading into the back room of the library where the children's books were as a kid in my summer holidays when I'd get my parents to drop me off. I would just go back there and read everything. And there were books with Anansi in. And I loved the idea of a god who was a trickster, who had stories, who between stories you were never sure if he was a person or a spider, because he was both at the same time. It was as if you were looking at him with your left eye, he was a spider, and from your right eye, he's a man, and it doesn't really change the nature of the story. I loved the fact that he could lose and did not always come out of his stories triumphantly. Sometimes he'd overreach himself. Sometimes he'd have a wonderful plan to trick people out of things, and he would get his comeuppance. So, I mean, that was something that had been with me since I was a kid. The amount of life in Anansi is special. And then I remember the frustration in actually trying to research Anansi Boys, the novel set sort of in the American Gods world, but not really. It's the same kind of thing. And eventually winding up with a book printed on bad pulp paper, published in the early 1920s from people who had actually gone to Jamaica and asked people to tell them stories. And suddenly having this ancient, literally crumbling, because it was published on 1920s pulp paper, and that stuff was not made to last. Adult stories and stories collected from adults for adults with Anansi, and all of a sudden he is tricking women into bed, and there's cannibalism in there as he's also tricking them from bed into the cook pot and stuff. And I'm going, okay, this is even weirder and more wonderful. And it's as if you've had this whole world of stories that's been told, but the only ones that have survived have been the ones for kids and the ones that are appropriate for kids.
And Nancy's a really interesting example to talk about, I think, Marlon, because he's a traveler, isn't he? He's born in West Africa, then he turns up in American culture, and I dare say, you know, my first exposure to him was through those American stories. I sort of thought that was where he was from. What can he tell us about how these stories travel?
He can tell us quite a few things. Firstly, I think with a lot of Western storytelling, particularly if they came out of the Christian tradition, there's still the clear hero and the clear villain. Like even when I mention Eshu, a lot of people immediately think he's a satanic figure because sketch him in for us just a little.
Yeah,
I mean, Eshu is kind of a god of mischief, but he's not the devil. Because it's just complicated. That's why I said that in some ways, so-called primitive people were more sophisticated than us, because they can grasp the idea of somebody being your friend today and probably your enemy tomorrow, or that the person who's telling you the story is tricking you. Because sometimes Anansi is telling a story, and if you come from a tradition where in the first 5 stories Anansi is a trickster, you're not going to trust what the trickster is going to tell you, but you still want to hear it. So I think why Anansi survives, and you know, even more so than some, is because he is so clever, but he's not that clever. He's crafty, but he's not that crafty. And as Neil said, he fails, you know, half of the time. It makes him this weird kind of everyman kind of god, which I think, again, it's just different. It's part of the fluidity, I think, of non-Western storytelling. You see it in Arabian Nights. as well. You see it in the pre-Christian European stories. You see it in the Icelandic sagas. You know, as a totally, I think, different worldview, which may be closer to human nature than we think. And I think that's one of the reasons why, why they endure. In some ways, the gods are actually worse people than us. They're they're flighty, they're immature, they're prickly, they change their minds too quickly, they're irrational. They're a little scared of us because unlike us, we can still surprise ourselves. But it's, I think, part of me honestly believe that these gods survive because they're probably real. And there's a part of me that still thinks that. There's a part of me that thinks.
Have you ever seen him? Have you ever felt his presence, Mark?
I can't ask Jamaicans these things. We feel everything. It's like asking people if they've ever seen rolling calf. I'm like, no, but I've heard one. It's a world which I remember growing up thinking I'm a person of science, and I grew up in the 20th century. But if you grow up in these worlds, you can't let it go. It's what Gabriel Garcia Marquez said. It's like, if you grew up in the Caribbean, you know that truth is wilder than the strangest fiction. And everybody thought all of that magical realism was just stuff he's doing for art until they read his biography. I mean, his autobiography, and I go, oh, it is. There is this world which I think that, and this goes into one of the central premises of American Gods, that if you've forgotten them, they stop existing. And it's not really true. And there are times in Jamaica where it's the unexplained that gets explained, that things that we don't, the mysteries that we don't have the language, that the church didn't give us the language for. And we still find ourselves doing it. Jamaicans still talk about lodestone and lime. Jamaicans still, talk about watch out for that black coffin going down the road at 12 noon, which I've seen. And so on. It's a world that world has been with us longer than any religion. It's not gonna go away. It's and every now and then, it's kind of like alligators in the town where I grew up. They paved the land, but every now and then an alligator shows up. I go, how did that happen? I go, because they're always gonna come back. And I think that's what happens with these stories. And
they move around too, don't they? Mm-hmm. Which is an idea that so much of your work, Neil, deploys so well. Taking these gods from all over the world, cultures across the globe, across time, to America, living these slightly reduced lives. We get that frisson of transplantation as well, don't we? I think John Pertwee said it was much more terrifying to encounter a Yeti sitting on the loo in Tooting Bec than in the Himalayas. And I think you believe that too.
Oh, absolutely. I wrote American Gods in a lot of, I wrote it for a lot of reasons, but one of them was just that I'd moved to America. I moved to America and I thought I knew what America was like because I'd been grown up watching American television, seeing American films, reading American books. How strange could this place possibly be? And I went there and it was stranger than I had imagined. Until you've been through a Minneapolis winter, you have no idea what cold is. You think you know what cold is. Cold is just when water gets wet and hard and it falls from the sky and it's fluffy and puddles are slippery and shiny. And then you realize, no, that's not cold. Cold exists far below that and far bigger. And there's so much of America was like that for me. Having grown up in the UK, where you feel like everything's there, we just have to go far enough back in time and you can find whatever you're looking for. And suddenly going to America, where it felt like, okay, everything's here, you just have to drive till you get there.
But you were a bit anxious about writing about America at first.
Oh, absolutely. utterly, utterly anxious because you're an interloper. You're here saying, I'm writing this book, you know, much in the same way that Marlon was talking about what comes first. People say, what comes first in a book? Is it the characters? Is it the plot? And normally the answer is, what comes first in a book is the obsession. What comes first is the drive to investigate and understand something that you cannot entirely explain. And after a while, you realize you're researching a book second. What you're doing, first of all, is trying to find something out and trying to understand it. And then suddenly something makes sense, something lines up, and you realize, this is a book, and this is my way of answering the questions for myself. So what came out first was just me trying to understand, why is it that every winter they drive a car out on the ice and take bets for charity on when it's going to go through the lake in the spring.
Did we live in Minnesota at the same time? I think we did. We overlapped, didn't we?
I think we overlapped, yeah.
I was there for 13 years.
Then we definitely overlapped.
How strange you never met then. I mean, I understand it's quite a big place.
Trust me, it's Minnesota. That's not strange.
I'm interested because what you both described a sort of research process, in a way, a process of trying to understand something, gathering up information. And I wonder whether there isn't, in drawing upon all these traditions and picking up these stories, a sort of syncretic impulse, an idea that you can almost take these elements and reconcile them all somehow into one universe where they all kind of tick away and function in some way. Marlon?
I think sometimes yes, because I think that's our natural instinct sometimes to want to find commonality. And if you're searching for commonality, you'll find it. Almost all these mythologies have a great flood. Almost all the mythologies I've read, including most of the African, still have the image of the serpent eating its own tail. So yeah, and we all have dragons. You'll find it. But I know for me, for Black Leopard couldn't happen if I was trying too hard to sort of unite those things. And I think that it's for one, the gods won't allow it because they're so wildly different, and they come from so many different worldviews, and they reflect different types of people. And I think for me, I know there is a danger with sort of uniting people or uniting creatures who would never have been united. And I see it sometimes when people write books set in a mythological West Africa, and half of the things are from East Africa. Or so on, or this is something that I realized I had to deal with in my book, that if I'm going to deal with the idea that the myth, the belief that men are born male and female and circumcision makes them male, then I'm going to have to reckon with female circumcision, because they may think it comes from a sort of a mythological belief, but it still results in brutality. So I think that's it. It's not it's you have to leave these things open, not just for the good in each, but you also have to recognize some of the terrible and some of the dangerous and some of the malevolent. And I think I had to sort of be kind of, I guess, heterodox in my thinking and how I deal with these stories and these creatures and so on. It wasn't just anybody can pick a creature and transport them. It wasn't just that. You have to also take the worldview. One of the things that blew my mind was the idea of African vampires and how, unlike European vampires, they're perfectly fine with daylight. That if I were to say, and the people who are watching and the people who are listening, I just say midnight, there's a whole series of connotations that just went off in your head. You know, the witching hour, it's scary, it's creepy, it's dark. If I say that it's the noon of the dead, you think of dawn of the dead, or you think of so on. These are negative things. You know, noon of the dead means your really cool aunt who you haven't spoken in a while is coming back to talk to you. It's actually a pretty joyous occasion because you probably could tell your aunt stuff you can't tell your mother. So it's the idea that midnight is when you and the ancestors, your favorite people in the world, are there to talk to you and guide you, completely changes the idea of night. It completely changes the idea of midnight. Now, these same vampires, their favorite time of attacking is 12 noon. It's like, no, I'm not hiding in the dark. I'm coming out in broad daylight to kill you. It messes your mind, especially for me, because, you know, I grew up on tons of fantasy, and it must be said, a lot of fantasy is really European medieval romance with fairies in it. So it's even for me, I had to sort of not necessarily let go, but kind of park the same foundational things I grew up with, and as I said, resist the urge to kind of merge and so on.
And what about your approach to that question, Neil? Because I'm thinking that, you know, both of the books that we're talking about have a quality that I feel I can also see in Milton's Paradise Lost, where we get Satan flying all over the earth, but somehow seeing things, registering things that are the products of Greek mythology. And you think, well, what is the timeline here exactly? You're not told explicitly how all of these things fit together, and yet they do somehow.
Well, they do, because we live in a world which has both Greek mythology and Miltonic mythology in it. And both of those things have changed how people have behaved, and both of those have changed how people have built things, how politics has happened, how countries have interacted. I mean, for me, when I was writing American Gods, what I wanted to write about was how it felt to be an immigrant in America, in this huge country. And a lot of it was just running across a few quotes from a folklorist named Richard Dawson, where he talked about interviewing people about folklore in America, and they would tell all of the amazing things that happened in the old country. And then he'd say, well, what about, you know, fairies or whatever over here? And they'd say, well, you know, they don't travel over the ocean, it's too far away. And I suddenly thought, that's the immigrant experience that I'm trying to write about. That's that thing of, you left something at home, you left your culture at home, and here are all of these cultures, all these people from all of these places, and they've come to America and they've left something behind. So why don't I just take those mythologies? Let's see if this works. Either it'll work amazingly, or it will be the kind of stew that is utterly inedible because the ingredients are too strange and disparate. But I think the most important thing is that your people have believed all of these things. And we're talking about people, and we're talking about the results of belief. The idea that gods are forgotten when people stop worshiping them is, or at least gods lack power when people stop worshiping them. It may or may not be true for the gods, but it's definitely true for people's relationships with the gods. They are effectively depowered. The Norse gods were doing just fine in Scotland in the 9th century. By the 14th century, they were reduced to being parts of place names, and possibly a few people sneaking out in the night to worship at stones that they couldn't quite really remember, but something was passed on. And by now it got to the point where, one reason I wrote a book on Norse mythology was because I wanted to actually just tell people, hey, these are these fabulous stories, and they're great. And here, I'm just going to retell them and hopefully tell them in a way that allows you to read them and then tell them orally again, bring them back.
are you also in a way trying to restore them or revive them in some way? Because in a way, I sort of think, reading American Gods, that you feel the pain of these kind of abandoned or forgotten figures quite personally. You make us believe it.
Absolutely, I love them, but I also, I hope, do my best to point out why they're not necessarily to be trusted, to be believed in, to be worshipped. I mean, we don't know a lot. There's so much that we've lost. There's so much that we've forgotten. But it is quite possible that the worship of Odin in Uppsala in Sweden involved 9 days of sacrifice, beginning with hanging animals and ending with hanging people. And I'm not necessarily sure I really want to bring that back. I'm good without it. I think people are okay in a weird way without gods. We can hopefully move on, but then we have to keep in mind the feelings of the gods in question.
And where are you in this, Neil? I mean, Marlon's told us about his in a project in a way to reconnect or to connect with a culture that he had a kind of shadowy idea of. What about the place of the traditions and the cosmologies that you were brought up with as a child?
I love all of the cosmologies that I was brought up with as a child. As I get older, I start digging much deeper into the culture. I'm interested right now in my grandparents and my great-grandparents in a way that I simply wasn't when they were alive, and when it all seemed like just part of today. It wasn't history, it wasn't exciting. And now I can actually go back to the 1911 census and realize how many Jewish immigrants from Europe were living in one room in Whitechapel, and going, I don't know who these people are. I don't know what drove them. We have tiny family legends, and that I find utterly fascinating.
But you've got such an interesting thing going on, haven't you, though? Because you've got that very deep ancient Jewish tradition, and then you also have the Scientological influence in your childhood as well, which is obviously one of the most a very recently founded traditions. So, what's the sort of what's the conversation between those two things?
I think, well, what was weird for me is neither of those two things were actually very important as a child. Because I was growing up in England, and was a scholarship boy at High Church of England prep schools, what fascinated me most was this sort of strange panoply of religions that my family were not part of. So it always felt like I was on the outside. I mean, I think one of the things that I got from that was a fondness for religion and a huge love of myth, but always feeling like an outsider. It's very weird to be the kid who gets 100% on the religious studies exam, and you know that everybody else in that room is expected to believe this, and you're not. You're one step removed, but you're fascinated by it and you love it. And I guess that for me, that was huge. But there's also a level on which I think I was building my own glorious anarchy of belief out of Batman comics and science fiction books and whatever I could lay my hands on. And that, the works of people like Roger Zelazny or Samuel R. Delany were probably the most important things for me. Look at, you know, when you sort of look back at what formed you, what built you. I think I could, you know, would I still be the same person without any of that religion in my life? Yeah, I think I would. Would I be the same person if I hadn't read Chip Delaney age 9 and not understood really what I was reading, but falling in love with it anyway and needing to know, or reading Roger Zelazny and going, I want to do that. This thing that this author is doing with gods and with magic and all of this, and the joy that he is giving me, I want that. There's a thing here. It's like touching a match to the flame of another match, and now my match is burning. And I think that, looking back on it, really was the most important thing.
You're listening to Free Thinking on BBC Radio 3 and BBC Sounds with me, Matthew Sweet. And on this programme, we're guests of the Royal Society of Literature, who've hooked us up with the authors Marlon James and Neil Gaiman. Go to our website and you'll find other fantastic worlds to explore in programmes on Octavia Butler, Paradise Lost, Quatermass, Isaac Asimov, and Volo Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman. Now, I'm interested in the moral environments of these worlds that you've both constructed. They're worlds in which death and violence never seem to be too far away. Awful lot of sex in them as well. I think we should observe. Nobody's mentioned that so far. I think that's rather important. And I'm thinking that this is something very present in your world, Marlon, in the world of the 13 Kingdoms.
Right. Yeah, I think again, it's impossible to overestimate how much of an effect Christianity had on folklore and myth making, and that's not necessarily a good thing, because I think that there is a sort of a sense of possibility in those stories that sometimes gets lost. With that, you know, one of the things in a lot of his Black Leopard, Red Wolf is poking fun at the sort of magic child who shall deliver us kind of thing. This kid is not going to deliver any. Well, the kid's dead, but this kid is not going to.
This is the object of the quest in the story.
Yeah, this kid is not going to deliver anything or anybody. But once you for me at least, ended up in a world with different people and different rules and shapeshifters and animals and so on, that that there are all these other sort of different kinds of systems and different kind of moralities. And I was, for me, I was very careful not to sort of impose my values on the story, because I think that's one of the many ways in which it can ruin a story. I don't want to read Vikings with a Christian sense of honor.
Yeah.
If I don't want to read Vikings who are squeamish about killing, or so. It's and that was also very important to me. If Conan is going to be a barbarian, and he should be a barbarian, not a grumpy but principled sword fighter. So yeah, I also I had to remember that the world was the characters, not mine, and that I had to, whether I liked it or not, and there are times when I actually don't, where I had to sort of be in the characters' world based on their systems, based on their moralities, based on their worldviews, instead of transposing mine on the story, which I think would be very easy to do, but ultimately it didn't serve the book or the characters. So if they have a very loose idea, for example, about monogamy, then the thing to do is to enter that world. Maybe you don't want to glamorize it, fine, but you can't you can't condemn it either. You can't bring that sense of your moral judgment in a scene where that would not, that wouldn't have happened. And I think that sense of the sensual and the possible and yeah, even the upfront sexuality of the characters to me was super important, because I didn't want it to seem again like I'm sort of writing a Victorian novel with monsters, which is a great idea. There are tons of them. But I didn't want to sort of, if I'm going to write a novel that is not connected to the West, I still can't have the West win morally. I can't have the West win philosophically.
And it's an incredibly bracing experience as a reader, this book. So you throw us into this world and its violence. There are sometimes there seems to be a death in every clause of some sentences, and you don't. And your instinct is to say we're being offered something that's sort of pre-psychological, that we associate with a very ancient kind of literature. But I wonder whether that's the wrong way to think about it.
It's not totally wrong. It's not wrong at all. I think, one thing we have to come to terms with the past is that the past was violent. The past was way more violent, which is not to let the present off the hook. But the past was more violent, and more life expectancy was way lower. Cruelty as a solution was something that was certainly commonplace, if not acceptable. And it was that was something that I very much wanted in the stories, a sense of that physically anything could happen, that you're literally talking about a world where you may not make it home tonight. And that sense, but that can also be a catalyzing thing. It can give the characters more of a seize the day spirit. It's something that can power an adventure going through countries and lands, the sense of uncertainty and the sense that there's always danger. And I think danger should be dangerous. The sense that anything could happen should happen. It's one of the things I like about George R.R. Martin's books, that the sense that anything can really happen. You don't get a sense that because somebody's a protagonist, they're going to make it through. And if it's George, they probably won't. But yeah, I think that it's the thing I like about what put it this way. One of the great things that reading these ancient stories put me back in touch with was a sense that literature is dangerous, and the sense that we're dealing with flammable materials here, and that was one of the thrills of it, and I wanted to get back to that. So yeah, there is danger. I will say this though, because I must be the only person who don't think I'm a violent writer. And I think there's a difference between violence and suffering. I think I pointed out that more people are dead in the first 10 minutes of John Wick than my entire output of work, because I counted. But it's one thing to kill somebody. It's another thing if the killing has consequences. It's another thing if there's violence, but it's another thing if there's suffering. And I it's not that I'm so much unflinching with violence as I'm unflinching with the cost of it. And I think that is why sometimes it resonates deeper than, say, 17 people being killed in an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie.
But I wonder whether it also acts as a kind of warning that's also issued by your fiction too, Neil, that these beings don't operate to our rules, that that we don't necessarily share values with them. I'm thinking of I don't know, like the bit in American Gods where some of those where some lost gods challenge the hero Shadow to a game of checkers, and the right to cave his head in as a sort of prize. These are not people who play by our rules.
Absolutely. But I think for me, I love violence in fiction if violence in fiction has consequences. I was never interested in violence as a solution. There's nothing like being, a 7-year-old kid who gets bullied to go, actually, I'm not entirely convinced that might does make right. The person, I can pick up a comic book here, and in it, the person who can hit the person who keeps hitting longest wins and was obviously the good guy. In reality, the guy who keeps hitting me can obviously go far longer than I am, and I still think I'm right. And you sort of you look at violence as being something that has a consequence. So in all of my fiction, I'm absolutely willing to do something monstrous. I'm willing to do terrible things in American Gods. The Graveyard book is a children's book that begins with essentially a serial killer killing 3 people out of 4 in a family. But I will always do that with consequences. And that for me is I think the most important thing, and the reason why deploying violence in fiction, because violence is in life, it's a smart thing to do. It's a wise thing to do. We're trying to take the things that we see, we're trying to take the world that we live in, put it on the page, and the longer I stick around, the more I realize that the world out there that we live in is stranger than anything that any writer has ever put down on the page anyway, and so much more unlikely.
But perhaps it also introduces, Marlon, something into the narrative that is kind of old, ancient, and cold as well. I mean, we've observed already about the way that the Greek and Roman gods didn't really observe our morality. It was clearly fine to be in the world of Greek myth. It's fine to commit rape if you do it disguised as a swan, isn't it? And yet, and the whole of that space seems kind of characterized by acts like that.
Yeah, I think though, I think one of the things that that draws me to Greek literature quite a bit is, I think in a lot of ways the Greeks are one of the first, if not the best, to get human nature right. That it's one thing with a villain. Let's pick a Shakespearean hero who may have done something rash. Coriolanus is rash. He's arrogant, and that costs him. That's his flaw. It's one thing if you're arrogant. It's another thing if your flaw is you ate your daughter. It's one thing if you're the protagonist and you have just killed your children to spite your philandering husband. That there is a certain kind of gut truths about humanity that the Greeks realized they had to grow through this kind of violent muck to get to. Well, and I think they understood that. So you can have all this blood in the Oresteia and in Medea, but it never seems gratuitous. Because they're getting to some of the just how dark jealousy and bitterness and feeling being wronged can play out. And I think that there's a certain sort of fearlessness with those type of stories, which I think the fantasy writer taps into, especially if they're drawing and pulling from certain myths, is to get a kind of fearlessness. I know I had to, because writing this book was scary. And part of it was cutting loose my ideas about right or wrong or just or what's worthy or worthwhile, and being somewhere else in a world which I would probably not survive a day. But yeah, that was very important to me.
Neil, do you think that we can use these stories from mythology to interrogate our own values. I mean, Marlon's just described a kind of dismantling experiment almost on those values. Just, write it and see where you end up. But do you think it has an application beyond that experiment within fiction? Do you think we can look to some of these ancient stories to sort of, check our own decisions and behavior?
Yes, but I think I mean, myths and ancient stories are always going to be a mirror, but they're always going to be a very unreliable kind of mirror, because people will look at them and find the things that they think they're looking at. What somebody in 16th century Italy saw when they looked at Greek Roman myths is not what we saw, and it's almost definitely not what the Greeks and the Romans saw when they were telling the story. We find the things that we need. Right now I'm loving Natalie Haynes's re-inspections of Greek myth in Pandora's Jar and in some of her stuff, because she will simply, she'll say, okay, this is what layers of men have said this story is about. And it's as if she takes a portrait and goes in with her cleaning fluid and takes off the layers of dirt and dust and time and says, now this, actually, once you've taken this interpretation off and that interpretation off, and this poem about it and that thing off, actually what you've got is this, which is a completely different story about a different kind of thing. And what I love about that is, on the one hand, there is truth in what she says. On the other hand, do I feel that this is the truth and nothing else is true? Well, obviously not. She's giving us an information and an interpretation and a way of looking at myths that is really good to have here in the early decades of the 21st century, when we, again, are using these mirrors as a myth. And I think all myths are incredibly useful. They're useful for understanding humans. They're useful for understanding the humans of a particular place. And by the same token, the closest that most of us will ever get to any of these myths is a retelling of a retelling of a retelling. We're not going to be sitting there on an ice floe, listening to Native Americans telling us coyote stories, or we're not going to be there in Iceland listening to a pre-Christian Thor and Loki and Odin story, because we don't have any, because they aren't there anymore.
And how do you find them useful, Marlon? In a personal kind of way. I mean, you've described that process of putting your characters into that world, into that moral world, testing them in that way, putting aside your values. When you go through that as a writer, what happens beyond the book to you once you've done it?
I mean, I hope I can separate still keep my own worldviews separate from the characters, or I'm going to have a body count.
But you've talked about the danger of it. This is not a,
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I can still maintain a distance. And the reason why I think I maintain a distance is actually to be fair to the characters and to be fair to the different characters. That I think in some ways, starting to adhere to one worldview is almost a way of starting to play favorites with characters, which I don't do. I think I love all of them pretty much equally, including the villains. But that said, writing Black Leopard did change my worldview about a lot of things. It did make me start to think. I remember once, it was years ago. I think the writer Anne Provoost. I don't know if I'm pronouncing her surname right. She was on a panel at the Penn World Voices Festival, and she said, if your God is threatening to destroy you, to wipe out your planet, to destroy all civilizations, why don't you just get a different God? I remember thinking, what? What are you saying? But the idea that religion is this sort of fixed authority that's immovable and unchangeable, and you just simply have, and it's all about how you submit to that, is something that if I was shoving it away, pushing it aside, writing this book made me kick them out the door and slam the door shut. And I think that the lasting effect of it is thinking I'm kind of surrounded. I mean, one of the things, one of the charms or pieces that you see a lot of time in African folklore is an Nkisi and Konde. It's a spirit. It's basically a wooden figure with a mirror, and sometimes to if you think there's a curse on you, you drive a nail into it. Sometimes you want to take one off, you pull a nail out, and now I have two of them. I don't necessarily think that I'm about to pray to Shango anytime soon. But I also think that a lot of times when people look at these stories, they tend to take it too much at face value. That if somebody who's performing a rain dance think rain is gonna fall. No, they don't. It's the ceremony of it. It's the community of it. It's the belief. The belief doesn't have to be proven, I would say. And I think, it has. I would say it has. Writing and going in these worlds have shifted my worldview a little bit, if not actually quite profoundly.
And I think entering both of the worlds that we've described has probably shifted ours a bit too. Listen, thank you so much for this conversation. I think we did get the spirit of the trickster into it, just a little bit, once or twice. Thank you so much to Marlon James and to Neil Gaiman, to the Royal Society of Literature for being our hosts, and to you for listening. And now it's time, I think, for me to look at my phone and see what questions are coming in from our RSL audience tonight. So I can just start firing those at you, I think, guys. Alison Murray asks, do you think as writers you inhabit a parallel universe to the rest of us? Zoom, I suppose, right now.
In our heads. I mean, I remember, particularly when I was writing Sandman, which took me the best part of a decade to do most of it. I think I spent more time with those characters than I did with my wife and my children. They were there in my head, and they were ticking along, and they were probably as real to me as anything going on in my life, because that was where I was spending so much of my time and attention, and just spare thoughts. If I wasn't thinking about anything else, I was pondering these characters and what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Marlon?
Yeah, I think, the answer is yes and no. That if you're a writer, if you're somebody who even, deals with the word of make-believe, you've been living an alternative in two universes from childbirth. You've been living, first as a reader. I'm in Jamaica, but I'm also at Professor Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. It's both, and and I spend a lot of time, quite a bit of my time growing up lost in these imaginary universes or making them up myself. Hopefully as any kind of writer, I think you're in different sorts of spaces. I think it was Tara Tempest Williams who said it. I think it was her, says, I write so I can have more than one life. And I think that's it. So we are, if we're not in alternative universes, we're living multiple lives. And I think that's what writing does.
Lee asks you, Neil, if you were a god or a patron saint of anything, what would it be? And they send all best greetings from London. Oh, there's a cryptic remark here as well. The goddess of refillable ink, cartridges, and black coffee. I think that's what Lee is offering himself as.
If I were a god, I'd love to be the kind of god that lives in a little shop. I haven't seen one of these shops around for a long time, but when I was a kid, they were the kind that sold tools and nails but before there were giant places that you go to on Sundays, kind of like these enormous mega churches filled with nails and do-it-yourself stuff. But those little places, and I'd probably be leaning behind the counter, which would be made of wood, and people would come in and they'd say, "I'm having trouble with me story." And I would say, then you must put down the appropriate offering. And they put down the appropriate offering. I don't know, some
4 candles.
Or 4 candles, or 4 candles, and or tea bags, or whatever it is that they are bringing. Ink. I'd really like some nice bottles of ink are really good. And I would take them, and then I would, give them illumination, probably by saying something like, the problem with your plot where you're trying to decide which of the 2 things to do, you can do both, my child. Now go forth, grasshopper, and write your novel. And that's the kind of god I'd like to be, just a sort of a novelty god.
Can we elevate you, Marlon, as well? What do you what brief do you fancy, deity-wise?
Oh my God. Because I usually think of being superhero more than a god. Who? I don't know. I haven't thought about it because I've never envied gods.
Okay, so I have to ask, Marlon, if you had a superpower, then what would your superpower be?
Oh God, I'm really obsessed with telekinesis, honestly. I've always been the whole idea of making things move to the point of where there's a huge part of my childhood I thought I really could do it.
So we're talking early Jean Grey here.
Early Jean Grey. This still happens. I'll be walking on a street, and if a street light is out, it comes on, and if it's on, it goes out. And I still think I have some superpower affecting it.
What
that's what I like to tell myself.
What did you think you'd moved as a child?
Oh God, the car, the house.
The house?
The parents sometimes. I knew I never wanted telepathy because I was always scared of what people think.
Oh yeah. That'd be a curse,
I
did
not want that.
But telekinesis, if you accidentally lock yourself out of the house, it's an incredibly useful skill.
I would, if you ask my parents that, they'd probably say, no, he didn't. He wanted to be Spider-Man because he was falling off the roof all the time trying to crawl and climb up walls that you shouldn't be climbing up. So they would disagree with me.
Sonia asks both of you, why do you think fantastical or fantasy texts continue to matter? Marlon.
Because I think fantastical texts sometimes tell us the gut truths about humanity in ways that I think whatever they call the other genre doesn't. It's you would think for something that sometimes calls itself realism, you'd find things about reality in them, but they're rarely. So, I would say social realism is really interesting. You have these really average men who somehow have probably hot women who they're cheating on.
You've just described French cinema there, I think.
I know, and they're living in these neighborhoods where there are never any black people. And everybody's just having ennui together. It's like, I think though, fantasy is still, again, and we've talked about this a lot, it's myth making and mythology telling, and humanity has constantly gone back to its mythologies to try to explain it's, you know, explain ourselves. We've constantly done it. And I think there's something about it. It's something about the way in which those stories are told that we somehow just seem to know more about ourselves. It's easier to talk about, you know, the darker sides of our nature by invoking monsters, I think. And sometimes it's necessary. I think sometimes it's necessary for us to otherize rather the monster, because we can't deal with it, you know, in the realities of it. So I think it actually gives us a tool to talk about. And we still do it. We still approach children like, okay, let's talk, who's the monster under your bed? So on. It still remains the most useful tool we have to talking to each other about ourselves.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that is fascinating me right now, and it's cyclical, but it's fascinating me right now because I have a 5-year-old son who is absolutely waist deep in all of this stuff, is the human capacity to believe things that we also know are not true, and to use those things that we believe that are not true as a skeleton key to solve real problems and as a way to understand the world. And I'm watching my son, little Ash, who is obsessed with the book and the graphic novel of Roald Dahl's The Witches, and will just have long conversations with me about the rules of the witches and how witches are not human, Dad, and this is what they look like. And then at the same time, he'll want to talk about the films of the witches, which he won't watch because he thinks they're going to be too scary, but he's seen pictures from, and he needs me to explain both in the world of the witches, how the witches remove their human disguises to look monstrous, and in the world of filmmaking, how you make people look like monstrous witches. And he's also completely clear on the fact that this is all fictional. And I love this. I love the fact that one of the things that is properly magical about us is our capacity for crying at the deaths of people who never lived except in our heads, is caring about people who only exist in stories. How do we do that? Why do we do that? So for me, the fantasy versus, you know, all fiction is fantasy. Doesn't matter what it is. If you're talking about people who don't exist, you're talking about things that never happened. It's fantasy. How far we as authors want to take that is up to us. What we want to do with that is up to us. Where, you know, it might be really fun to write something that for 250 pages is an absolute mainstream mimetic fiction campus romance, and then have a god walk into it on page 350. What would that do to people's heads? What would that change the way that they read? And actually thinking about that, that's kind of, I guess, what Kingsley Amis did with The Green Man a long time ago, which is which feels utterly like a normal mainstream novel until you're 200 pages in and suddenly the protagonist gets to talk to God or possibly the devil. You're never quite sure. But, you know, the point is, we as writers get to deploy all of the tools, all of the ingredients to create an effect, to build up feelings, and to make people care and to make people see the world differently. And as far as I'm concerned, the tools of fantasy are fabulous tools, and they work. And they worked for we have fantastic stories right now that we can date back 8,000 to 10,000 years because we know the geological formations that they seem to be talking about. This is the volcano that went off here. And I think we can assume that as long as people have been people and communicating, we've been telling each other stories, and they've been fantasies.
Anzia says, you've both written books with mythological source material originating in other languages. Some say they understand their experiences differently in their native language than is captured when they speak in another language. How may this influence how you interpret stories and write from myth into the stories that you create? So yes, a sense of what might be gained or lost as you move, as you move between languages or traditions.
I mean, well, something is always gained and something is always lost. It's like asking what's gained or lost in translation. Something is always lost in translation. Something is also gained as well. I think, though, that's the point to these stories. One of the things I liked about a lot of African stories was there was no interest in keeping the story intact. It's supposed to change. It's supposed to take on new meaning. It's supposed to, it's supposed to be told in a different way. My grandfather sometimes would tell us the same story 5 days straight, but one or two things changed. And so first is to accept that any sort of new language on a story is going to change it in some way, and also that's fine. The whole notion of an authentic version, an authentic story is very Western. It's like the director's cut. Mm. It's this idea of it's still grounded in this idea of one truth being there somewhere. And I think, again, that's a very Western Judeo-Christian kind of view that just never really existed in storytelling. If two people are giving oral narratives, it's going to be two different stories. There's no guarantee that the Odyssey that we are hearing now is the Odyssey from 500 years ago. And it shouldn't be either. It shouldn't be. I think one of the things it does with all these different languages and we're interpreting them is that it keeps these stories going and keep them sort of fresh, and it allows us to look at things or pay attention to things that we don't see anymore. Sometimes languages can do that. I mean, 2 examples. Emily Wilson just translated the Odyssey. And one of the things that Emily did, which I think I've read every version of the Odyssey by now, and I don't remember seeing it in any, was almost every version of the Odyssey before that had servants. There are no servants in the Odyssey. They're slaves. It's a big difference between a servant and a slave. And I don't know. I've been through quite a bit. I've been through the Fagles, the Fitzgerald. I don't remember reading an Odyssey where we're now suddenly dealing with slavery. Mm. And it changes it. And there's an example of, again, language translation, interpretation, in some ways getting even closer to the original story sometimes. And I think that's a good thing. I think letting go of I'm not interested in authentic versions and original truths and blah, blah, blah. I don't think no storytelling tradition survives that way. And I think
Neil.
I was just going to say that if you talk to people who used to be married and ask them about their marriage, you will hear 2 very, very different stories about the same thing in 2 very, very different languages. And it may have been the same story, but what you're going to learn is going to be incredibly different. I'm always aware, particularly when I was doing my Norse mythology, I had piles of different translations and the original Icelandic with dictionaries and literal translations, and was always aware that there were overtones I was going to be missing, and there were cultural overtones that I was going to be missing. And I was just as aware that these stories, as we were seeing them now, were written down in a pre-Christian era as artifacts, essentially written down for poets, so that Icelandic poets would understand what these poetic references were about. And that those stories were not the stories that would have been told even 300 years earlier. And probably each person telling the story told a different story. But you're also thinking of a world in which stories are currency. And they're currency because if you go from place to place, the first thing, the best thing that you can do is give people entertainment, they will feast you, they will feed you rather than eat you. I'm just loving John's cat here. I
think only we can see. I don't know whether the audience can see that cat.
The audience cannot see John Fawcett from the British Library.
It's very much Schrodinger's cat on this broadcast, isn't it? Yes.
It has insinuated itself onto the screen, and it's glorious. And I've completely forgotten. I've lost that sentence utterly. Where was I?
Well, I think perhaps maybe the cat is trying to tell us that we have, in fact, run out of time on this. Our time is up, I'm afraid. I'm going to wave two brilliant books in front of me here and just say, look, if you've not read these books, look at that. You can get lost in them for the rest of your life if you really wanted to, I think. And there are we've got two more installments of this. If the spirit is willing, Marlon, we very much hope it is. So listen, thank you both so much for such a fascinating night, Marlon and Neil. And now I'm handing back to Molly, who is appearing on my screen there and is probably appearing on yours too. So from me, thank you very much and good night.
Oh, thank you, Matthew.
Hello, thank you so much, Neil, Marlon and Matthew, for such an exhilarating hour of conversation. Hour and a half, I think we got from you in the end.
Oh.
I'm Molly Rosenberg. I'm the Director of the Royal Society of Literature, and it's my great pleasure now to advise you all to buy any of Neil and Marlon's books that you don't already have. You can use the link that's going into the chat now, I think, or is being sent over to you, and you can buy them from bookshop.org. Every book you buy will come from an independent bookshop, so it's a great way to support those two at a difficult time. Buy for yourself, for friends, everyone you know. If you want to come to all of the RSL's events online, you can buy our brand new digital events pass for £25, and I don't think you could get a better recommendation of it than this evening. For £25, you'll get access to 25 events about words in all their forms over the course of a year, and we'll be sending you that link over now too, or you can find it on the RSL website. Recent discussions, as well as this brilliant one with Neil and Marlon, have included Philippe Sands and Claudia Rankine, David Mitchell and Brian Eno, and Stephen Fry and Shappi Khorsandi. And you can watch all of those back on the RSL website, or indeed with our partners, the British Library. I've also got another notice for you. If you're a writer of colour starting out in your career, looking to learn and get support from other writers, please look at our new mentoring programme in partnership with Sky Arts. The Sky Arts RSL Writers Awards will give 5 emerging writers of colour a year of mentoring from an RSL Writer Fellow. The link's going to you again now, so please enter. The programme's being led by RSL Vice President Bernadine Evaristo, and all the writers being mentored will have a group mentoring session with Bernadine too, so it's definitely worth submitting. And the deadline is the end of this month, April. If you want to find out anything more about the RSL, you can go to our website, our Twitter or our Instagram. We'd love to see you again very soon. Our thank yous for this evening, for making everything possible tonight, go to our partners, BBC Radio 3 and the British Library, particularly Robin Reed, John Fawcett, B. Rowlett and the RSL's Beth Gallimore. I hope that everyone can take this evening's beautiful event, beautiful discussion into a wonderful end of the week. Thank you so much again, Neil, Marlon and Matthew, for setting us up so well to get into the weekend eventually. Until we see you next time, good night. Thank you.